got rooted to how ISIS were using small drones. That was obviously very famous as well. ISIS and the fighters there were using small, cheap drones, and that was a big news piece for quite a few years. But Ukraine was doing very similar things, and so by the time Russia invaded again in 2022, so he started working with them to use drones, and that really helped. That really helped him. Really help DIAC people find ways to use drone data to really prove that their land was being encroached upon, and also prove their land rights. They use drone data to build better maps, to construct better maps and data. Oh, absolutely. I think the combination of the two, both satellite and drone data, is incredibly potent and powerful. We're going to be seeing even more of that in the future. So drone data has the great advantage that it's ultra high resolution. And I mean, you can get down to many tiny pixels. You can see incredibly small objects with drones data. But the problem, of course, is that
Hello and welcome to Infer Talks, a podcast where we put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining us today is an expert on unmanned aerial vehicles, technology in humanitarian aid, remote sensing spatial data, and data policy and ethics. She's also a former researcher at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. My guest today is Ms. Faine Greenwood. Ms. Faine, welcome to the show.
great to be here.
Okay, Ms. Fain, let us start our conversation as you're someone who's worked on issues of open source drone maps. So let me ask you, for any layperson or for our audience, what are some of the unethical ways in which open source drone maps can be used, both in peacetime and in conflict?
Sure thing. So the big deal about small consumer drones is that they're one of the first technologies that have made it really easy for people to make high resolution maps. Before the rise of small drones, it's very expensive to make maps. You had to use a manned aircraft. You had to find ways to acquire satellite data, which is quite difficult to do still. And drones have made it possible for people to go out to the store, to a normal store, and buy something that you can use to make amazing high resolution maps. So that's really democratized the process of map making and collecting aerial data, but it's also made it a lot more easy for people to use this data for potentially bad purposes. So we're seeing a lot of interesting ethical questions arise over, what are the ethical ways to control drone data? What are the privacy implications of drone data? What are some of the ways that drone data can be used to target people? I think we're seeing a lot of that happen, for example, in the Ukraine war, not necessarily speaking about orthomosaic drone maps, but we're seeing ways in which drone data can be used to target people in wartime. And in the humanitarian aid sector, we certainly worry a lot about ways that open source data, including remote sensing, that includes both drone data, satellite data, and aerial data, can be used to learn things about people and can be used to harm people. So there are concerns about things like what if there's high resolution maps released in refugee camps? Could people use that to attack people? What if there's a high resolution data pertaining to areas of a refugee camp where particularly vulnerable people might be living? So that's a concept that my some of my colleagues at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative have worked on, called demographically identifiable information, or DII, which differentiates itself from PII, personally identifiable information, because it's information that's about an entire vulnerable group of people, not just individuals. So those are some of the ways that we're thinking about how to protect people from drone data, and that's one of the ways we're also hoping to, in the future, develop more legislation and more rules around how drone data is controlled that kind of try to anticipate some of these privacy risks and dangers. I think we can learn a lot from the Ukraine war and what's happening there, and other conflicts, to better inform how we think about this for peacetime and for humanitarian aid operations as well.
So when you speak about, availability of drone data and also the fact that, it can be used to target vulnerable groups, could you cite some examples that you may have gathered as a result of your work?
I mean, there are some cases where we're looking at drones. So, for example, in the South Sudan conflict, which is what some of my colleagues at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative were focused on using satellite data. They were using satellite data to attempt to identify war crimes and abuses by the South Sudan, by the government of it's the Sudan government at that time. And there were definitely some challenges there around realizing, and they realized that some of the satellite imagery could actually be used in ways that were unanticipated, led to unanticipated consequences. Releasing that data potentially led to some cases where people were targeted. So I think it's the goal is to really thinking about what we're releasing and how we're doing it, and thinking of ways to make sure that we're doing this in a safe, ethical way. Also, collecting more use cases and examples of how this data might be used to target vulnerable people. I think we're also seeing a lot of examples out of the Ukraine war as another where drone imagery or photographs are being used by both sides to successfully call in airstrikes or target people. So I think that's an example of how really high resolution drone data can lead to unintended consequences, and we have to really think that through and how that might impact civilians in the future as well.
I will come back to Russia-Ukraine conflict in more detail in light of your own recent write-up. But for now, let me ask you. You wrote in one of your papers on the use of drones for map making and property rights. What did you infer? And could you briefly tell us if drones help make map surveys more precise? And could maps from drones reduce the amount of litigation on land encroachment and land measurement disputes in countries relying on legacy handmade maps?
Absolutely. This is one of the great use cases that drones are being put to. One of the first things I started working on, I was at New America, which they were doing some work with a MIDI network on this in 2015. So drones, again, as I mentioned, drones democratize aerial data collection. They make it a lot easier to make maps. One of the best early examples of this dates back 2015, 2016, when Indonesian activists started working with the Dayak people in Indonesia were dealing with a lot of problems with having illegal encroachment on their lands. They were having illegal mining encroachment, illegal palm oil plantations, and they had very little legal recourse because it was very difficult for them to prove this was happening. So he started working with them to use drones, and that really helped. That really helped Dayak people find ways to use drone data to really prove that their land was being encroached upon, and also prove their land rights. They used drone data to build better maps, to construct better maps and data, and they were actually able to use some of that information to win court cases. So we're seeing a number of cases of indigenous groups doing this around the world nowadays. I know some of this has been being done in the Amazon and Peru. So the number of cases of indigenous groups using really low cost drone mapping methods to kind of fix this data imbalance that existed in the past, which is an impressive example of how drones can be used for a land right to help protect land rights.
So I may be slightly digressing from the conversation, but do we really need to have some form of legislation in place to have them admissible in any court to substantiate claims of people in terms of their land dispute or in terms of their respective rights?
Absolutely. I think we need to do a better job in the future of finding ways to incorporate drone data into our legal systems. This is also a big concern for the war crimes courts. I think what we're seeing, again, this referencing Ukraine, other conflicts where drone data, and this has also happened in Iraq and Syria, where drone data may indicate potential human rights abuses or war crimes. We also have some legal uncertainty over how to incorporate drone data into existing legal regimes as evidence. So I think there's a great need. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't comment in great detail, but I think there's a great need for more legislation and a better legal understanding of where drone data fits in. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be very pervasive in the future. It's like other forms of digital or open source evidence. We need to find ways to incorporate drone data into our legal systems. Because I think that'll be beneficial for a lot of people.
Okay, moving on to our third question. Let me ask you, Faine. Is drone map making becoming a new market for freelancers globally, or is it too niche of an area? If it were to be such, how could it become one without violating or possible legal considerations and individual rights?
So drone map making is definitely a gigantic, a pretty huge global industry nowadays. Even back in 2015, when I was first started doing research in New America on global civilian drone uses, I think I found a drone freelance company in every single country I looked at. This was in 2015. So you can pretty much guarantee that nowadays there are many, many, many more examples of drone companies offering these services, and pretty much everywhere where it's legal to do so. And in most countries, it is legal to use drones to at least some extent nowadays. So it's a huge industry. Now, there's definitely a lot of litigation, also controversy there as well. For example, in the United States, there's certainly some conflict or some questions around, like, for example, who is licensed to be a surveyor? I think in most cases, drone people making drone maps or creating drone orthomosaics, getting around that by not legally referring to themselves as surveyors. They're using their data to perhaps inform map making operations, but they're not claiming the legal status of surveyors. But that is certainly a concern because in most countries, surveying is a legally certified process. You need to undergo a lot of training, get a license for that. And obviously, most people who are flying drones are not certified surveyors, but they are using their data to inform other spatial concerns. There's a lot of map making things you can do. They're not necessarily surveying, things like map making for agriculture, for science, for archaeology. Archaeologists actually are some of the biggest users of drones and have been for many, many years. So there's a lot of ways you can use drones, not necessarily designating yourself as a surveyor. There are a lot of legal questions for sure. They're still being worked out around the world over where do drones fit into this legal designation of a surveyor? Where does drone map making fit in legally? I think there's definitely a lot of open questions about, again, the laws around who gets to make maps, who gets to have maps submitted in court. So I think we're going to see quite a few years in the future of this happening in just about every country litigating this, trying to figure out where this fits in, which is going to be an interesting time period to live through. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future.
Yeah, you've actually spoken about, this whole thing being more democratizing. Uh, are there different platforms like crowdsourcing platforms which encourage different, drone map makers to sort of put their work out there to be used or to be purchased by other people?
Yeah, so one of the best examples of this is Open Aerial Map. So Open Aerial Map is an open repository for drone data. So people have uploaded many different drone images and map layers to this, and GIS people can use it. That's a one great example. There are a lot of other examples of drone data uploaded to platforms like Esri's. Esri's platforms have many examples of drone data that people can use. And of course, the other platforms like Humanitarian Data Exchange, one I'm very familiar with, and that's maintained by UN OCHA. They have a lot of examples of drone data as well as satellite data. So I think we're seeing a lot more. And there's many other examples, of course, because are some of the best known. But there's a lot of places where you can access open drone data and can incorporate that into your own map making projects. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future as drone data becomes more popular. I also think that it needs to be accompanied by more thinking about how are we vetting drone data for privacy and security purposes. We still don't have really great standardized protocols for evaluating if drone data is safe or not. That's something I'm working on. I know others are working on trying to figure out ways to develop better criteria for evaluating if drone data is safe, evaluating it for privacy concerns and issues. But again, I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the future. I think it's overall a positive thing. We just need to make sure we're doing it as carefully as possible.
What would be some of the privacy concerns in at least even peaceful situations, which map makers should be considerate of?
Absolutely. So a big one is things like identifying individuals. So there's definitely a lot of concern that drone data might be used to identify individual people. Now, drone facial recognition, as I've written in the past for Slate and other publications, still is not really a feasible thing where facial recognition is pretty good at the terrestrial level. Cameras that are very low to the ground and catch people in relatively stationary locations, but identifying individual faces from the sky, from a moving vehicle like a drone, is a lot more difficult. We really aren't there yet technologically. However, that doesn't mean it's impossible to identify individuals from drone data using less high-tech means. What if, it's a well-known individual, especially the drone is flying at low altitude? There are definitely ways that you could identify an individual person from drone imagery. Drones have high resolution cameras. There are a lot of ways you can identify context clues from drones. There's definitely concerns about identifying individual people from drone data. And again, the data coming out of the Ukraine war is providing a lot of examples of how drone data can, in some cases, be so high resolution that you can identify individuals. You can also identify things like their status. For example, there are some videos coming out of the Ukraine war showing POWs, prisoners of war, and now that is a violation of some war crime statutes. You're not supposed to disseminate information about POWs, but those people, it's also low altitude drone data that could very well be used to identify individual people. So that's one example of how some of the problems there. Drone data can also be used to identify patterns of movement. So for example, what if a drone is being flown over a single location multiple times? You could you could certainly like perhaps identify a license plate or individual vehicle. You could identify where that vehicle is going. And we're seeing things like in the United States again. There are some cases where police departments and some places in California, for example, have received permission from the FAA, the United States Federal Aviation Administration, to fly drones beyond line of sight, which is often not legal in many countries still on an experimental basis. So this police department's flying drones every single day to almost every 911 call in this town in California. And that certainly creates a lot of questions about repeated surveillance, persistent surveillance. The drone's not flying all the time. It might be flying at the same location a lot. Could people use that data to identify, okay, this person goes from point A to point B? Could that be used by a bad actor to target that person or stalk that person? So that's another big concern. And again, also things like demographically identifiable information. Again, we're talking about refugees, people in other vulnerable situations. Could that data be used to identify patterns of movement, identify, instances of where people are? So there's a lot of different privacy concerns that exist that we need to be cognizant of as we're moving forward with drone data.
I suppose you've provided a very exhaustive list of examples where certain ethical considerations may get compromised. Moving on to our next question, and this is more about being a futurist and since someone who is writing on technology from a futurist perspective and also from an ethical perspective, how could AI and drone map making softwares become a force of good for different professionals such as engineers, urban planners, farmers, architects, and government agencies? And now, since we're actually seeing synthesis of different technologies, what's your take on that?
Sure. So I think so putting the AI part aside for the time being, I think that drone map making has already proven itself in the last decade to be an incredibly powerful tool for so many individuals, organizations. It's made map making much cheaper and easier. And we're seeing so many amazing uses for drones in sectors like transportation. I do consulting for some transportation agencies in the United States who are doing really great stuff with drones, everything from monitoring construction more inexpensively to monitoring traffic flows, to trying to develop better traffic areas, map making for improving pedestrian infrastructure, environmental monitoring. We're doing so. There's a lot of use cases. Just thinking of a transit agency, and also again, just beyond transit. Obviously, there's so many other examples. There's agriculture. People are using drones for everything from making better wine to studying crop diseases. Scientists are certainly using drones in tons of different ways, everything from climate research, so mapping glaciers and monitoring climate change, to forest emissions in the rainforest. And people are using drones fitted with sensors and setting them up at the rainforest to collect better data on emissions. We're seeing things like researchers using drones to collect a whale snot. So when whales spout, they actually eject a little bit of material that can be collected by a drone. And scientists are using that to better understand whale health. So, and now archaeologists are using drones extensively for new discoveries. So there's tons of application. Obviously, in transportation infrastructure, again, is huge. Things like monitoring oil pipelines inexpensively and safely, monitoring things like bridges or electricity, ways that are a lot safer for people. You're not having to put a human up there in a particularly dangerous situation, high altitude. You can send a drone up there a lot of the time and kind of reduce human risk. And that comes down to a basic tenet that gets repeated a lot about drones. I think it's a good one, which is dull, dirty, and dangerous. You use drones for things that are dull, dirty, and dangerous. Boring stuff, repetitive stuff, stuff that requires human danger. You can deploy a drone in a lot of cases, and you can make that a little bit easier for people. So I think there's a lot of huge advantages there, just speaking of drone data and AI aside. Now, again, AI in the drone map making sector, I think it's still pretty early days. We're seeing some interesting applications of using computer vision, automated techniques for identifying items in remote sensing. So we're both satellite data and drone data. Some ways to automate things like identifying, say, plant species in a drone or satellite photograph. We're getting much better at that, especially when using multispectral data for that purpose. Things like automatically identifying. Let's say you're inspecting railway tracks, you want to automatically identify vegetation encroachment. You can use drone data for that kind of thing, or railway data. You can use computers to automate identifying the vegetation. So, and those might not be the most glamorous applications, but I think they're the ones that are by far the most feasible and that where we're seeing a lot of progress today. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. And that's what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, so sorry to interject you, but I've also seen a lot of writings where, and I'm not an expert on this issue, but I've seen different writings where different experts have actually said that a combination of both remote sensing data and data provided from drones could actually help, uh, you could say, help make either better decisions or help process data in a far more effective way than someone was or an agency was particularly relying on, say, satellite data only, even when it comes to purposes like agriculture.
Oh, absolutely. I think the combination of the two, both satellite and drone data, is incredibly potent and powerful. We're going to be seeing even more of that in the future. So drone data has the great advantage that it's ultra high resolution. And I mean, you can get down to many tiny pixels. You can see incredibly small objects with drones data. But the problem, of course, is that small drones are, well, small. They're not going to cover as much range as a space satellite. But you combine the two, you can really get potent results. For example, in web maps, you can combine layers of drone data and layers of satellite data and you can really zoom in on the resolution in places you really want to get more detail on with drones, and you can really get the bigger picture with satellite imagery. You can also combine things like satellite multispectral sensors or hyperspectral sensors, satellite SAR sensors. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can combine different types of spatial data into one web map, really produce fascinating results. One thing I know I've done before is overlaying things like LiDAR layers captured by drones. We put small LiDAR sensors on drones nowadays with data collected by satellites, data collected by other sensors, data collected by people taking photos on the ground. You combine all those things into web maps and really produce fascinating results, really learn new things. So it's going to be exciting to see those data combinations in the future and what we can develop.
Well, there certainly seems to be a lot of fascinating prospect for this. Moving on to our next question now. And then this is about, you know, drawing your attention to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, something on which you've recently written for the Foreign Policy magazine as well. The use of the drones has become conditioned with achieving swift military victories like those in the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh and the civil war in Libya between Haftar and GNA. While drones have become synonymous with precision targeting and reducing escalation, how are they contributing to protracted conflicts, as in the case between Russia and Ukraine? And I would like you to throw some light in backdrop of your recent write-up.
Certainly, I think it matters what kind of drones we're talking about here. So I think there's two different categories of drones that are being used quite widely in the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the conflicts around the world. And what I'm particularly interested in, what my research has been focused on, is a category of drones that I refer to as small consumer drones. So those are unlike big military drones like the Predator drone, the famous Predator drones, the Reaper drones used by the United States of America, or other large scale military drones that are intended for military purposes that are made by military contractors. I'm really interested in the drones that are intended for civilian uses, intended for consumer use, or that are made by hobbyists from, cheap DIY parts. I'm really interested in how those drones are being used in conflict, and they're vastly cheaper. They're easier to obtain. You can't go to the store and buy a Predator drone. You can go to the store and buy a DJI Mavic. So I'm very interested in how these small, cheap drones are being used in conflict, just as I'm very interested in how these small, cheap drones are being used for disaster response and for map making and for in civilian contexts. So with that in mind, that's how I'm approaching the war. And so what I've been doing since the invasion, Russia first invaded in 2022, is I've been maintaining an online database where I'm just tracking and collecting examples of how these small consumer drones are being used in the war. And with that information in mind, when the year anniversary of the invasion came about, I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy, kind of summarizing my findings. And among them are that one, DJI drones, which are made by the Chinese company DJI, which is by far the biggest producer of civilian drones on the planet. They're by far the most popular in the war, so they're being used constantly. Now, DJI stopped officially selling drones in Ukraine and Russia in April 2022. But since they're a very popular consumer product around the world, people are just buying these drones in other countries and bringing them into Ukraine and Russia in great quantities. A lot of these are coordinated by volunteers. So volunteers are often sending money, and that money is being used by others to purchase drones and bring them into the conflict. And they're being used very extensively. And they're going through great numbers of them. For example, I think the average estimated lifespan of a DJI Mavic drone on the battlefield in Ukraine and Russia is approximately 3 days. So they're churning through pretty huge numbers of these drones. Since they're a consumer product, they're easy to obtain. DJI makes a lot of these drones. So there's been a lot of, I could certainly talk for hours about that. So I won't digress too much. But there's a lot of questions there about how much control that DJI as a private company and a Chinese company has over the conflict. Again, there's no viable replacement for DJI drones, really, because they're such a massively important and pervasive company. There's a lot of questions about how small drone tactics differ from big drone tactics. And that's, I think, to your question about swift military victories in reducing escalation precision targeting, long range drones, I think, are a pretty different prospect where you can fly them from many, many miles away. Whereas these small drones we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia are being flown. They've got a pretty short range. So for a DJI Mavic, for example, you're maybe flying at most a couple of miles away from yourself. That's a very different prospect than flying a drone halfway across the world or from, many hundreds of miles away, which you can do with long range drones. There's a lot of interesting questions there about that distinction. That's what I'm focused on studying.
Yeah, and just a couple of lead questions with respect to that. First of all, I suppose you mentioned that the company has actually suspended its supply of drones to Russia and Ukraine. Is there any particular reason why? And then, secondly, I suppose perhaps a tweet that was shared by you on your Twitter account, if I have it correctly, which said that the company's product was somehow able to give away the location of the operators itself. How much of that is going to be a challenge, both for the company and also for those who are actually operating them in conflict situations?
Sure. So DGI has explicitly said many times over the years that it is a civilian company and they do not sell to militaries. They don't want their products, or they don't publicly. They've said they don't want their products to be used by militaries. They've made that very clear in their press statements. And so that's the reason why they stopped sales to Ukraine and Russia. From their point of view, they are not a military supplier. They don't want, to be seen as a military supplier. And that's why they stopped selling directly to Ukraine and to Russia. Now they didn't. Now they do have the ability to geofence their drones or put restrictions on where their drones are operated geographically. And they actually did this in 2017 over Iraq and Syria, but they have not done this in Ukraine and Russia, which I think is probably due to not wanting to get embroiled in political controversy over it. But they have taken the measures of restricting access to those drones in those countries because again, they do not want to. They have said they do not see themselves as a military company. They don't want to be seen that way, and that's not their market. So I mean, some may argue with that, but that's certainly what they have said many times, and they don't want. That's why they've restricted access and are so drone ID is a whole other. So basically, DJI. A lot of countries around the world are introducing regimes that will make it easier to identify drones in airspace. So integrate them in. That's called unmanned traffic management. And drone ID is a big part of that. So this is being approached in different ways in different countries, but the idea is that the drone will emit some kind of signal that can then be picked up by somebody else to identify who's flying the drone, where is it going at all. And DJI is as a kind of a measure to integrate their drones into society and kind of as a good faith measure, I think. Back in the 2017 introduced the Aeroscope, which is a proprietary tool that they were selling to security forces around the world that let people identify DJI drones. The way this works is that the DJI drone was emitting a special signal called drone ID that could then be decoded by someone with one of these receivers. There was a lot of controversy about this early in the war because Ukraine accused DJI of intentionally disabling their aeroscopes to benefit Russia. As it later transpired, it appears that was not the case. It appears that there were hardware issues that were resolved. DJI was not doing this intentionally, as far as we know. But that was certainly part of the controversy around that. And now drone ID. So again, so DJI has intentionally built this drone ID system, and that does allow the drone to be identified for the purposes of selling this tool that the DJI, I think, hoped would build confidence in their drones around the world as a safe product to use, and gave some. Now, so that's a whole other element of that. So it was done on purpose. Now, DJI really messed up, in my opinion, because they represented the signals as encrypted when they were not. So it was researchers or hackers made it very clear in April 2022 that, well, DJI said the signals were encrypted. They were not encrypted. They could be decoded by people with sufficient skill or knew what they were doing. Now, but the other thing that's happening is that pretty early in the war, it was open source. Hackers released an open source methods of disabling drone ID. So if if you know how to do this, and you have a DJI drone, you can actually hack the drone in such a way it does not emit this drone ID signal anymore. And that's exactly what fighters in Ukraine and Russia have been doing ever since. So the vast majority of the drones that are being used in Ukraine and Russia are DJI drones, have been hacked in such a way that they're not emitting this drone ID anymore. So they're much more difficult to identify, and it's safer for the soldiers to fly them. Now, DJI is constantly trying to override these hacks. They don't want people to be using these hacks. They want the drones to be emitting the drone ID because that's what they've designed them to do, and they don't want them to be used in the war necessarily. So whenever they release new drones, they often release updates that counteract these patches, and the hackers come back in and get around the patches, and it's been a constant cat and mouse game ever since. So that's an example of what's going on there. But again, it was an intentional move on DJI's part, and so that's why that's there. So it's going to be now they are phasing out Aeroscope. They announced actually, I think last week, that they're no longer going to be making Aeroscope products. So that's as drone ID advances around the world, perhaps they thought it would be necessary, but that's so there's a lot going on in that space.
I really appreciate you walking us through that process. And now we'll move on to our next question. And this is more about how the technology has become more democratized and has become a disruptive tool, particularly during conflicts, when used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and targeting larger adversaries. Or they could be a force multiplier, regardless of which side uses it.
Right. So yeah, I think drones are much more. They certainly are a force multiplier. I think Ukraine has been demonstrating this in spades. And now I think the interesting thing about Ukraine is that they have been using this technology for an incredibly long time. I think people don't realize that Ukraine was one of the first countries to use small drones in conflict all the way back in 2014 when Russia first invaded in 2014. Ukraine had a lot of people who were drone experts, were also and they came out of the hobby drone community, which I was also part of at the time. Where a lot of people who were just really interested in model aircraft and airplanes got really into building drones around 2013, 2014, because the price of cheap components and electronics had gone down after the release of the smartphone, and it became a lot more possible to build computerized GPS carrying, camera taking, photograph taking aerial vehicles, and about in the early 2010s. So this big hobby community sprang up online. Chris Anderson for DIY Drones had a big part to play in this. So this hobby community existed in 2014, and when Russia invaded, a lot of Ukrainians who were part of that community sprang into action, started building small hobby drones or using consumer drones, which also had just arrived on the scene in 2014, to fight the Russians. They figured out how to use drones to drop bombs, small bombs. They figured out how to use drones to surveil the Russians. They were doing it very inexpensively. So that was kind of an innovative thing. They didn't get as much attention in 2014 because I think a lot of the attention got rooted to how ISIS were using small drones. That was obviously very famous as well. ISIS and the fighters there were using small, cheap drones, and that was a big news piece for quite a few years. But Ukraine was doing very similar things. And so by the time Russia invaded again in 2022, I expected that Ukraine would be doing very impressive things with drones. They'd been working on this for a very long time. And interestingly enough, by the way, the OSCE was also using drones in the monitoring mission in Ukraine and Russia for many years, actually. In February 2022, OSCE was flying DJI drones as well as larger medium range drones on that border. So border observers were using drones to monitor this conflict, or monitor the border rather, during that kind of imposed stalemate. So that's an interesting. So there was a lot of interesting uses of drones, and but I think Ukraine has really proved that you can actually have a very effective drone response. You can make that drones have made surveillance and targeting way cheaper and easier than before. I think that's the reason that I think at the early stages of the war, I think a lot of people expected two things that did not happen. I remember a lot of predictions were made about this that did not pan out. A lot of people expected that one, Russian electronic warfare methods were really good, so ipso facto, Ukrainian drones would be blasted out of the sky pretty much immediately, and that they wouldn't really matter because, again, Russian electronic warfare would make the small, cheap drones the Ukraine was using irrelevant. That was not ended up not being true. Electronic warfare is absolutely being used by both sides, but is not proven to be as incredibly effectual as people expected. So it exists. It's a huge problem, but people are still using drones constantly. It seems like to fighters, the benefits of using the drones outweighs the risk. Um, Secondly, I think we're just seeing a lot of Ukraine. I think a lot of people predicted that Russia would not bother with using cheap consumer drones because they had better stuff. That has not proven to be true. It pretty quickly became apparent in the first days of the invasion. People on social media spotted Russian soldiers using DJI drones on initial invasion as they kind of advanced into Ukraine. And that just expanded ever since. I think especially as the Russians observed what the Ukrainians were doing with drones and how effective they were with really cheap consumer drones, I think a lot of Russian fighters started jumping on the bandwagon as well. Not necessarily with official sanction from the Russian government. It was more that fighters on the front line started acquiring drones through donations or other sources and using them because no one was stopping them. And the Russian government has sort of gone along with this. The Russian government and the Ukrainians, of course, do not like the fact they're so dependent on a Chinese company, DJI. They're certainly trying to make their own substitutes or their own drones. But again, it's very hard to make something on the same scale and the same quality as DJI for them, especially during a war. So there's a lot of reliance on DJI products because there isn't really a great alternative. Not, but people they're aware this is a problem. It just there isn't a great solution right now. There's a lot of work being exerted on building DJI replacements, but again, really hard to do that. I don't think it's going to be. I think it's going to be very hard for either Ukraine or Russia to succeed at that anytime soon, especially the scale that's needed. That's a big part of the context there. But yeah, there's a lot of democratizing of aerial surveillance reconnaissance. We've never seen a war this well documented in human history, I believe. And that's going to have a lot of repercussions for the future. And that's going to be interesting to witness.
Lastly, let me ask you a question on confidence building measures. We have seen the US shoot down a Chinese balloon over the US airspace. And with growing tensions and naval presence in the South China Sea between the US and China, should the two countries look towards some CBM to reduce accidents or when drones lose contact with their base? Could such instruments be important in reducing miscalculations, or the two countries would be unwilling to work out such an arrangement?
Well, I'm not a specialist on long range CBM. The drones I mostly work on are much more short range than that. Not really a lot of risk of the drones I work on being spotted over China. I do have some thoughts on this general idea, and this is something I think is the principal distinction in international humanitarian law. And it's a huge problem. So the problem with small consumer drones in conflict or in wartime in humanitarian aid and disasters in general is that we have no good way of telling them apart in the air. With the manned aircraft, you've got a human pilot, we radioed, we have a lot of different mechanisms for identifying aircraft and manned aircraft in airspace. We're really good at that now. The problem is that small consumer drones, again, the ones you can buy at the store, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I generally talk about. We don't have a way to tell them apart in airspace. We don't have electronic methods for doing this. We have drone ID systems like DJIs, for example, but they're imperfect in a lot of ways. Not everybody knows how they work, can access them. Obviously, people disable those tools and tactics for logical reasons. But the problem is that we now are facing the prospect of airspace filled with a bunch of identical looking drones. Again, both Russia and Ukraine are using drones that look exactly the same, that are made by the same company. So there's really no way to tell them apart in airspace. And unlike with the manned aircraft, you can at least paint a different color or put a symbol on it. Drones are so tiny that it's very difficult to see any identifying marks when they're up in the air. They're very small. So we really have a big problem here that has implications for international humanitarian law because IHL, as it pertains to manned aircraft, assumes that the aircraft has some way to identify itself, right? It assumes that again, there's a human pilot who can say, "I am who I am." It assumes that the plane's carrying a transponder or that it has access to ADS-B. It assumes these mechanisms don't exist for drones. And that creates cases where you could have mistaken identity. And we know this has happened in Ukraine and Russia, where you just have no idea who's flying what drone. And imagine in the context of humanitarian aid workers who must preserve their neutrality for obvious reasons in conflict, they don't want to be perceived as combatants. If they're flying a drone in airspace that is occupied by other drones being flown by combatants, they have no way of saying, I'm a humanitarian drone, don't shoot at me, or I'm a humanitarian drone, I'm not a threat. We have no way to do that right now. And that's a huge problem. So I think that's something I definitely would hoping to see more action on in the international aid community and IHL communities figuring out ways to navigate this. I think UTM systems, again, unmanned traffic management systems, as I mentioned, are going to provide some aid to this, but we're going to need technological solutions and international standards for this. And again, this is being worked on. I'm certainly not the first person who's come up with this idea, but it's something I think is incredibly important. We need international mechanisms for identifying, okay, this small drone belongs to this person because we don't have anything like that right now, and it's a huge mess, and it's going to become a bigger problem in the future. And Ukraine and Russia is definitely highlighting why it's such a big problem. So, but yeah, that also would pertain to things like longer range balloons and targeting as well. Of course, I think there's somewhat similar principles at play, but I think my focus is more on the shorter range stuff and the way we just cannot tell these drones apart in airspace, and that's a huge issue.
Thank you so much, Faine, for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much for staying with us through this conversation with Miss Faine Greenwood. Our team works very hard to make this work possible. And it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content to show your support. And if you'd like to stay informed on upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.